is the mother of all talk shows royalty. If they had royalty in America, he would definitely be a prince. He is a journalist, a writer, an activist, an intellectual of the highest rank. And he joins me now. Again, I'm grateful to Chris Hedges for being with me. Chris, it's been a tumultuous few days. I'll not ask you a question. I'll simply say, tell us how you see it.
Well, I heard you list some of the analytics, which I think are actually really important, because they implode this notion that somehow Trump's political base is driven by racism. Of course, some of it is. But as you may have mentioned, support from white men without a college education dropped pretty significantly from 48% in 2016 to 37%. 26 of his votes came from non-white Americans. That's the highest percentage for a Republican candidate since 1960. He got 32 to 35% of the Latino vote. He doubled his support with black women. Again, it was small to begin with, 4% in 2016, but it rose to 8%. He increased support among white women from 53 to 55%. The support from black men jumped from 13 to 18%. And this despite a slew of accusations about rape and sexual assault and open misogyny and the racist tropes that he constantly delivered to white supremacists. I mean, even his support among the LGBTQ community went from 14 to 28%. Wow. And the polling seems to indicate that without the pandemic, he would have won, because that was the top issue for 41% of the voters who supported Biden to 3-1. Among those for whom the economy was the top issue, that was about 28% of the electorate. Trump got 80% of the vote. And I think we have to ask what the figures say. I think about the two ruling parties. And I think that again, as you got from your talk before I came on, if the Democrats, which I expect, continue to be captive to big donors on Wall Street and refuse to embrace the anti-corporate message, promises for Medicare for all, Green New Deal, et cetera, that drew such enthusiasm to Bernie Sanders, we are going to get a competent fascist, because Trump was his own worst enemy. He couldn't focus. He couldn't read a briefing book. He was too impulsive. But there are many people, Tom Cotton, Michael Pence, and others in this kind of Christianized fascism who are competent. And I think that the analytics show that at least, almost half of this country has had it with the two ruling elites. I don't think they were blind to who Trump was, but they don't trust these smooth-talking Democratic politicians like Joe Biden or Barack Obama, because they sold them out. And I just make one other point. The lies these Democrats told was far more damaging to the well-being of the working class than any lie Trump ever told. Trying to sell them NAFTA and austerity programs. Remember, it was Clinton that cut the welfare, destroyed our welfare program, and 70% of the original recipients were children. These were all these smooth-talking, kumbaya unity Democrats. And I think the country is in serious trouble. Half of the country believes that the election was fraudulent and rigged, and I don't see anything in Biden's record, or more importantly, the people Biden has surrounded himself with, that indicates that he's going to respond to the deep malaise and antagonistic tribal divisions that are tearing apart the United States.
Very powerful, Chris. Thanks for that. Let's talk about who he is going to surround himself with. He repeatedly stated that he would be reaching out across the aisle to Republicans and offering them cabinet places. The early indications are that the one that matters most to me, I'll be candid with you, is the State Department, and that will go to Susan Rice, who was a creature of the Democratic Party's last war machine, the people who brought us the slave markets in Libya. Other Wall Street figures are apparently being lined up for the Treasury Department and so on. How bad, how ugly is this cabinet going to look?
My guess is very ugly. And Biden has said as much. He's made it very clear that if Medicare for all, in essence, universal health care, ever reached his desk, he would veto it. He would veto the Green New Deal. He has spoken to the 1%, or actually the 1% of the 1%, but the country's wealthiest individuals and biggest Democratic donors, saying that he will impose no regulation on Wall Street, and Wall Street is run amok, completely unregulated. He himself was one of the architects of the war in Iraq. He was one of the architects of the militarization of the police force and the massive expansion of the prison population. He has, throughout his political career, been utterly obsequious to the most retrograde forces of American imperialism and American capitalism. He used to be called, in the Senate, they used to call him Senator Credit Card, because a lot of the credit card companies, for tax reasons, are based in his home state in Delaware, which, by the way, the largest credit card company employed his son, Hunter. And there wasn't a piece of legislation that their lobbyists didn't write that he pushed through. So I see nothing in his past. And I think the indications, as you correctly point out, are that those who are surrounding him will continue what the two ruling elites have essentially pushed forward, and that is extremely dangerous. He doesn't have either the moral or the intellectual capacity to do much else. He's a very limited, hollow figure. So I'm extremely worried, and in the long term, but also in the short term, because a lot of the Trump supporters, rightly or wrongly, believe that the election was stolen. A lot of them are armed, and I think that we have already seen close calls in terms of attempts to assassinate mainstream Democratic leaders, to kidnap the governors of Michigan and Virginia. They were actually going to put them on trial and execute them. We had a couple of years ago where a Trump supporter mailed pipe bombs to most of the hierarchy of the Democratic Party, along with CNN. If those had gone off, he would have decapitated the Democratic Party. And so it reminds me of Yugoslavia. I mean, eventually they're going to succeed. And I think that Trump will continue to incite his base. The divide is so wide that they don't trust the system. They don't trust the mainstream or liberal media outlets, and I have some sympathy for that, frankly. CNN, MSNBC, and they're almost unreachable. So that I just find, having covered the war in Yugoslavia, many echoes of the disintegration and breakdown in Yugoslavia that led to the horrible fratricide that I covered.
The trope of Trump, that he had gone down to big media, big tech, and big money, has the benefit of being true, doesn't it?
Yeah. Biden, I mean, you have to look at the super PACs that were set up largely by Silicon Valley and Wall Street. And they pumped tremendous sums of money into the Biden campaign. And they weren't doing it because they love democracy or they want universal health care or a guaranteed personal income. They did it because they knew they would get what they paid for. And one of them is that there was this move to break up these big tech monopolies like Google and Facebook. That will never happen now because they were largely the major funders of the campaign. But I also want to add, not just the major funders. Those tech platforms used their ability to censor information to shut out information that was damaging to Biden. In particular, most recently, the revelations that came from Hunter Biden's laptop, which the Biden campaign never pretended that they were untrue. They never said that they were false. But you had, even in the New York Times, headlines calling it disinformation. And that goes back to Podesta, the Podesta emails in 2016. Podesta was Hillary Clinton's campaign manager. Those were released by WikiLeaks, and the tech platforms caught a lot of the blame. So now, along with the mainstream media, MSNBC, CNN, New York Times, Google, Facebook, they all did their job. But that's very dangerous. In the short term, of course, it helped the Democrats and helped get rid of Trump. But in the long term, it further eroded their credibility. I think there's very little credibility left now. I mean, these cater to the Democratic elites and to the Democratic constituency. The 91% of the readers of the New York Times identify as Democrats. And what you've done is siloed the country now within their own echo chambers, both on the left and the right. So as a former reporter for the New York Times, I was appalled because that credibility, willfully shredding that credibility means that you can't communicate with the rest of the country because you've exposed yourself as so partisan. We're all happy to see Trump go, or many of us are happy to see Trump go. On the other hand, many of us are extremely concerned about what comes next.
Well, what happens immediately next? There has been an obvious recount, legally required, mandatory recount, triggered in Georgia. We don't know what that will turn up. But there are also huge number of complaints about other places, particularly Pennsylvania and Michigan. Does Trump have any chance of getting this into the Supreme Court, in your view?
No, I don't think so. I think if it was down to one state, like Florida under Bush versus Gore, yes. But I think because it's multiple states, it's going to be hard for him to get through the legal system up to the Supreme Court. But that is not a particularly informed decision, but that's what I think.
What will Trump do now with his remaining 2 months? Might he, if only to cock a snook at the deep state that has apparently succeeded in overthrowing him, might he pardon Snowden and drop the charges against your friend and mine, Julian Assange?
Well, that would be the best Christmas gift ever. I don't know. I think he'll throw as many bombs as he can and be as destructive as he can towards these forces that, I mean, it honestly did conspire against him. You had the heads of former intelligence agencies and internal security agencies, the FBI, Brennan, others, pounding him for 4 years as a traitor and a puppet of Russia, et cetera, in essence, accusing him of treason. I think it would be completely in character for Trump to just destroy as much of the infrastructure as he could. That's what I expect.
Will he continue in politics, pass over the baton to one of his children, or are we looking at someone right field from out with the immediate Trump circle, but singing some of the same songs?
He'll definitely continue as a political figure because he's reshaped the Republican Party into a personality cult. And that's why people like Lindsey Graham, who are, when they ran in 2016, very dismissive of Trump, have been utterly obsequious to Trump because it's the only way they could get reelected. So he will remain a powerful political force. Remember that the second highest vote in American history after Biden's has been Trump's. So that gives him a lot of political leverage. And so much of the Republican base is personally loyal to him that he will be a political factor. Whether he runs again in the next election in 2024, I suspect not. I think you're going to see the rise of a far more competent and far more dangerous neo-fascist who will ride that sentiment that I suspect Biden and the Democratic Party will not address. And remember that the stresses within the American landscape because of the pandemic and the inability to deal with the pandemic are about to become much worse. So we have an estimated 300,000 Americans that will be dead by December. This figure is expected to rise to 400,000 in January. The unemployment numbers do not reflect real unemployment, which is probably close to 20%, because those who have stopped looking for work, those who have been furloughed but have no chance of being rehired, those who have jobs, part-time jobs, but still are below the poverty line, are all counted as employed. And the pandemic won't be brought under control because, as inept as Trump was, and he was inept in dealing with it, the fundamental problem is our privatized healthcare system, which is designed to make money. It's not designed to deal with a national health crisis. All we've seen over the last couple decades is a reduction. I mean, we have less than 1 million hospital beds, and this is all because of hospital mergers and closures and reduced care in communities, especially rural communities. You've seen major cities in the United States like Milwaukee forced to erect field tent hospitals. In states like Mississippi, they've had moments run out of ICU beds, and so you have the raging pandemic, but then you have the economic fallout from the pandemic. And we still have 48% of frontline workers in the United States who are not eligible for sick pay. We have over 40 million Americans who have lost their employee-sponsored health insurance. We have thousands of bankruptcies a day, many of them tied to exorbitant medical costs, even for people who have insurance, because of what we call co-pays. And you have about 15 million renter households. That's about 34 million people who were unable to pay their rent in September. That's about 17 billion in unpaid rent. That figure is expected to rise to 34 billion in January, and it is accompanied by the lifting on evictions and foreclosures, which means millions of families, and Jared Kushner, who's a big slumlord, has already begun the process of evictions, millions of families thrown into the street. Hunger in U.S. households has tripled over the last year. These are government statistics. This is from the Department of Agriculture. The proportion of American children who don't have enough to eat is 14 times higher than it was last year. A study by Columbia University estimates that an additional 8 million Americans have now been can be classified as living in poverty. And meanwhile, of course, throughout the pandemic, the billionaire class has profited in obscene ways. The 50th richest Americans have as much wealth as half of the country, and it's not just African Americans and the poor and the working poor have been hit, but millennials, which is about 70 million people, who have an estimated 4.6% of the U.S. wealth. So all of those stresses, and the country is already disintegrating, all of those stresses are going to put further pressure on a system that can't sustain stress.
Fasten your seatbelts. Chris Hedges, thank you for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. How's the poll?